The dictator is being forced to negotiate. Erdogan is proposing a meeting between Putin and Trump in Istanbul, while Trump even believes that his meeting with Zelensky and Putin should have taken place 3 months ago. Everything is going according to plan. Air defense systems for Ukraine, paid for by Europe as part of the US and NATO plan, are already on their way. The fallen ruble. After the not-so-successful negotiations in Istanbul, the Russian currency noticeably depreciated on the Moscow exchange. And economists' forecasts for the ruble's recovery are bleak. By the way, the Russian dictator's younger brother is also going hungry. Lukashenko is asking Putin for money. It's obvious he'll hear in response, "There's no money, but hang in there." And the debt business is a living kopeck. In Russia, against the backdrop of sharply rising losses in Ukraine, the number of funeral agencies has noticeably increased. All this and more coming up in our broadcast. In the meantime, please like this video and subscribe to the Ukraine Today channel. There's a lot of interesting stuff ahead. So Donald Trump has announced a trilateral meeting with Zelensky and Putin. This will definitely happen, although such a meeting should have taken place 3 months ago, the American president said in response to journalists' questions. Donald Trump also did not rule out the possibility of imposing secondary sanctions against Russia in less than 50 days. When asked whether the US is now close to making a decision on imposing restrictions, the American president answered in the affirmative. Let me remind you that earlier, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan stated that he wants to arrange a meeting between the head of the Russian state, Putin, and the American leader, Donald Trump, in Istanbul to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. According to him, he will find out if this is possible by talking to them this week. Back in June, the Kremlin stated that Putin and Trump are open to making instant phone calls to each other. However, a face-to-face meeting can only take place after concrete agreements have been reached and thorough preparations have been made. Let me remind you that on September 3rd, Trump's 5-day ultimatum expires, after which the US may impose 100% tariffs against countries purchasing energy resources from Russia if there is no progress in resolving the situation in Ukraine. The State Department has noted that the deadline set by the president is not strictly fixed and may be extended. However, the Kremlin has once again made it clear that they will not stop the war in Ukraine by the expiration of Trump's 50-day ultimatum. And according to Reuters sources close to the Kremlin, Putin is not intimidated by the prospect of tougher sanctions. He is determined to continue the war until the West agrees to his terms for a settlement. Ukraine's defense forces continue to systematically destroy the enemy's logistics, military-industrial facilities, and of course the personnel of the Russian occupiers. Powerful explosions were heard in the Rostov region, Stavropol, and occupied Donetsk. We'll tell you in more detail in just a minute what was hit this time by a well-aimed drone. The US State Department has approved a possible sale to the Ukrainian government of air defense equipment and M109 self-propelled howitzers. The total value of the deals is estimated at $330 million. What else will our allies supply to the Ukrainian armed forces, and what is Putin preparing for? All the details are in our military review.
37 strikes, but supposedly without losses or destruction. No, this is not a literary oxymoron. This is the report on the drone attack in Nevinomysk, Stavropol Krai, Russia, provided by Mayor Mikhail Minenkov. According to the Astro Channel, drones attacked the chemical plant Nevinomysky Azot. Russian media clarified that this enterprise is a major producer of nitrogen fertilizers and ammonia, and is also part of the Eurochem group. There were also complaints about an attack by unidentified drones in the Rostov region on the night of the 25th of July. Eyewitnesses told the SHOT channel that they heard between 5 and 7 explosions in the suburbs of Taganrog. The US State Department has approved a possible sale to the Ukrainian government of air defense equipment and M109 self-propelled howitzers. The total value of the deals is estimated at $330 million. It is reported that for $150 million, Ukraine will be able to purchase about 12.5 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles.
That's roughly the number of vehicles we've lost during the Russian-Ukrainian war. Apparently, they've decided to replenish the vehicles that were destroyed. They want to deliver new ones. Well, this is not a bad situation for us. We actually need them. These are good vehicles. They've been used in various wars, and they're adapted for modern warfare.
The German defense company Hensoldt announced that it has signed a contract worth more than 340 million euros to supply Ukraine with modern radars to strengthen its air defense system. Also on the night of the 25th of July, there was a global outage in the Starlink satellite internet service. Users around the world reported losing their connection. Among those left without internet were Ukrainian defenders on the front lines. The company acknowledged the issue, and Elon Musk personally promised to fix the cause. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced personnel changes in the Ministry of Defense and further steps in the field of security and defense. The head of state spoke about the appointment of new deputy defense ministers of Ukraine and also noted that he continues to hold negotiations regarding the defense of our country. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin named the construction of strategic submarines as a priority in the development of Russia's navy. According to Putin, this task is given top priority because submarine forces supposedly protect Russia.
I suppose, and this is my subjective opinion, that switching the conversation to the submarine fleet is meant to distract Russians from the fact that, well, when it comes to the military space or like the aerospace fleets as strategic missiles of strategic purpose, ballistic missiles. Something there is not something is going wrong for them. That's why there have been talks about the entrance.
Ukrainian intelligence officers have received confirmation that Russians are using chemical weapons on the front line. This is confirmed by one of the commanders of the Russian army, who discusses preparations for the use of chemical weapons banned by international conventions against the positions of Ukrainian defenders. The Security Service of Ukraine published the radio interception.
A significant strike hit the occupiers' location in Donetsk, on the territory of the Zasyadko mine. 8 hits targeted the occupiers' base and the railway infrastructure. All of them were right on target. Local social media pages also reported on the incident, clarifying that it was loud in the Kyiv district of the regional center. The occupiers themselves complained about 8 HIMARS missiles being launched and the strikes. One of the impacts was even caught on video, after which thick smoke rose over the site of the hit. Air defense systems for Ukraine, funded by Europe as part of the US and NATO plan, are already on their way. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Sysky, after a conversation with the Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO's Combined Armed Forces, US Air Force General Christopher Cavoli. We also discussed the US and NATO plan for us to receive air defense systems funded by Europe to protect our land and save the lives of civilians, Sysky said. He expressed his gratitude to US President Donald Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte for the prompt delivery of these systems. They're already on the way, noted the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. In Russia, against the backdrop of a sharp increase in losses in Ukraine since the beginning of the year, the number of registered funeral agencies has noticeably increased. Among other reasons for the increase in the number of new funeral companies cited by market representatives is the rise in profitability in the funeral business. We'll explain what lies behind this convoluted wording next.
There is a funeral boom in Russia. While all other sectors of the economy are struggling, funeral services are only expanding their assets.
We just recently got back from a business trip to the Kremau, to Tyumen. A new beautiful crematorium has opened in Tyumen. But if it weren't for, let's say, knowledge of the industry and the understanding that the facility is next to a cemetery, when you walk in, it feels like you've entered some kind of grand palace. So today it's a place filled with light, warmth, and care, and all of this is thanks to private investment.
Funeral companies in Russia earned a record 40 billion rubles in just the first 4 months of this year. In addition, in 2025, 805 new funeral companies were established.
They're always burying us. They'll probably drop dead themselves soon, but they keep burying us non-stop.
All of this is due to the record losses in the war this year, which of course are not publicly acknowledged in Russia itself.
Since January of this year, for example, the Russian side has lost 100,000 soldiers killed. Dead, not wounded. I'm talking about the dead.
After all, according to Putin, there is no shortage of men. In fact, there aren't enough women.
We discuss the demographic issue regularly. We probably all remember that famous song from Soviet times, when the girls came to the dance and some stood off to the side, because according to statistics, there were 9 guys for every 10 girls, right? Well, as I understand it, our statistics have changed. Now, we actually have a shortage of women.
The Russian authorities have even hidden demographic registries so that people no longer know the real numbers. But the filling up of cemetery plots speaks for itself.
The main motivation is to save your own skin. First of all, it's clear that the unit rosters are being cleaned up, and, well, we all know about this. I think they closed off the data so that people wouldn't see the mortality figures.
Funeral services are also getting much more expensive. That's why there has been a rise in demand for cardboard coffins, which are much cheaper than wooden ones. As a bonus, you get an exclusive design.
The hexagonal coffin with a full-color designer image helps many people in a way to revive memories of the deceased. We've had coffins like that, with others, even to have photos of the deceased during their lifetime placed all over the surface of the coffin.
And naturally, where there's big money, lawlessness thrives as well. Knowing about the million ruble payouts to the military, a huge number of scammers have also appeared.
There are some unscrupulous agents who, for example, will call you out of the blue before you've even contacted anyone and say, you know, we can arrange the funeral for you. And of course, that's already a reason to be on guard. In our case, either the doctors pronounce death or the police do. So accordingly, you can choose one of the two, whichever you prefer. Where does this sudden
Info leak.
There is a leak of information.
Putin is so eager to conquer Ukraine that, just like in that famous Soviet song, he doesn't care about the cost. Only this price will have to be paid not by him, but as always by ordinary citizens.
Putinomic skills not only on the front lines. A powerful explosion destroyed the entrance of a 10-story apartment building in Saratov, as shown in video footage from the scene. Several people were killed. Searches under the rubble are ongoing. At the same time, the Russian Ministry of Emergency Situations called what happened a pop. Emergency services reported that the building collapsed from the 10th to the first floor. A criminal case has been opened regarding the gas explosion in the 10-story residential building on the grounds of providing services that do not meet safety requirements. The 10-story building was constructed in 2009. Over the past year, the management company changed 3 times, and none of them conducted a gas leak inspection, according to the publication MASH. Local residents also reported that the gas mixture supplied to homes in the Leninsky district no longer contains an odorant substance with a hydrogen sulfide smell. This is already the second gas explosion in a residential building in the Saratov region in the past 3 weeks. Russia's economy is basically collapsing right before our eyes. After some rather unsuccessful negotiations, the ruble noticeably depreciated on the Moscow exchange. There are also problems with the workforce, and now there is a need to recruit migrants whom Putin dislikes so much. Meanwhile, the largest car manufacturers have reduced the work week and declared a crisis in the industry. We'll explain why next. But it's not just Russia that's facing an impending economic collapse. Lukashenko is already begging Putin for money. But Russia's main source of income now seems to be on the brink. More on this in the following report.
It seems the ruble is on a downward slope. After the third round of talks in Istanbul, which did not achieve much success, the ruble noticeably depreciated on the Moscow exchange.
The problem with Russia, as with any autocracy, is that politics dictates the economy, rather than economic feasibility determining the processes that should exist in the country's economy. That's why they kept the ruble stable there. But because they held it so tightly, what seems to me was a request from the leadership, specifically Putin, it led to a situation where many export-oriented sectors of Russian industry started operating at a loss.
How could that be? So now, it turns out that without migrants, Russia won't be able to overcome its labor shortage at all. But at the same time, the Kremlin isn't exactly fond of these very migrants.
We proceeded from the idea that it is necessary to update migration legislation in the area of state control over foreign citizens.
Now let's go into more detail. The president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs stated that the labor shortage in the Russian Federation exceeds 3 million people and called for bringing in migrants, which, by the way, also won't really change the situation much.
The full-scale war, which Russia calls the special military operation, what has it led to? First of all, a significant number of people have left the country, especially after the partial mobilization in September. Secondly, because the cost of contracts for the war against Ukraine was constantly inflated, this problem isn't going anywhere. On the contrary, it's only getting worse. They are trying to cover it up with migrants, but migrants create internal pressure.
Meanwhile, the car market has dropped by 40%, as a result of which Gaz, following Russia's largest car manufacturer AvtoVAZ, will move its employees to a 4-day work week. And no, this isn't for worker productivity like in Europe, but in hopes of cutting costs.
They already want to reconsider salary payments there. They want to introduce fines if something is done wrong somewhere before. They used to turn a blind eye to this, but now they will reduce salaries and cut bonuses. The attempts to save money also lead to an increase in the number of dissatisfied people in the country. It was already growing, but now the growth and discontent are simply accelerating, and sooner or later this will have the most revolutionary consequences.
But that's not all. The collapse of the economy is already being felt by the owners of huge shopping malls.
For this purpose, the national project Efficient and Competitive Economy has been established, and the president has set a national goal for sustainable and dynamic economic development.
Yeah, right, all about development. For example, the owners of the largest shopping mall, Aviation, have decided to sell the property. And that's all because the government has finally closed off any possibility for Western brands to return.
One of the problems with the Russian economy, let's put it that way, is that import substitution exists only on paper. So when you say we're going to get rid of Western brands and have our own, it turns out that in reality, that's all just theory. In practice, what you actually create is something of a much lower level, of significantly lower quality. Accordingly, those business centers that thought domestic brands would take over are losing out because of this.
But Putin isn't the only one with problems. Lukashenko is begging again. The Minister of Finance of the Republic of Belarus is discussing the possibility of attracting additional funding from Russia.
Right now, Russia really needs to think things through because it already has plenty of its own problems. And now there's Belarus on top of that. Logically speaking, of course, Belarus should have been refused. But I repeat, authoritarian regimes are more likely to sacrifice themselves, well, not themselves, but rather the well-being of their citizens, to be more precise, than to stop supporting their satellites, for the simple reason that they will always fear that if Belarus sees Russia not giving money, it will turn to China, to Turkey, or even to the European Union.
Meanwhile, Western sanctions have deprived Russia of many oil buyers. But now things have gone even further. Now even raw material suppliers are turning away from them. And such signals mean only one thing: the sanctions are working. And this is already becoming noticeable for the Russian Federation.
And with such economic circumstances, what can we even say about life in the occupied territories? In the Donbas, liberated by Putin's degenerates, there is a real disaster. There is practically no water left, the infrastructure has collapsed, and the utility workers have been taken to the front. There is no more water in the pipes, now it is delivered by tankers. The situation in the city resembles the true Middle Ages. Locals say it's worse than in the 90s when the USSR was falling apart. There were lines back then too, but at least the water ran without interruption. Now, there isn't even that, and more details and theories are emerging about the passenger plane disaster in the Amur region. Let me remind you, 50 people died. The most likely cause of this disaster is the age of the airliner. It is over half a century old. Next, we'll tell you how the
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
International sanctions caused by Putin's war are slowly but surely undermining Russian civil aviation.
A new tragedy in the Russian skies. This time the victim was a passenger AN-24. The aircraft was flying from Khabarovsk to Tinda with a stop in Blagoveshchensk, but it lost contact at the most critical moment shortly before landing. According to the Far Eastern Transport Prosecutor's Office, during landing the plane was unable to land and went for another approach. It was at that moment that contact with the captain was lost.
During an aerial reconnaissance mission with a Mi-8 helicopter, the aircraft's fuselage was discovered in a remote area on a mountainside.
The wreckage was found just 15 kilometers from Tinda Airport in the Amur region. The plane was only a few minutes away from the final point of its route. There were 49 people on board the AN-24, including 6 crew members and 43 passengers, among them 5 children. And all of them are dead. While officials are cautiously mentioning a possible technical malfunction, more and more details are beginning to surface in the media. In the land of the great and mighty, they continue to operate airplanes that are already half a century old. The AN-24 was manufactured in January 1976 and made its first flight as early as February. Since then, it has spent decades in the sky despite its age, outdated technology, and numerous accidents.
The Primary Transport Prosecutor's Office is conducting an investigation into the rupture of the left landing gear component of the AN-24 aircraft. The AN-24 aircraft, which arrived in the regional center from Bodaibo, had its landing gear catch fire during landing.
Yes, half a century ago, this plane was cutting edge, but today it's a flying coffin that should have been scrapped long ago, yet it continues to operate flights. This is happening in a country where the authorities have been proclaiming greatness for years, boasting about billions in oil and gas revenues, import substitution, and sovereign aircraft manufacturing. Every year, they promise state-of-the-art Russian airplanes on television. They showcase their might at parades, but in reality, 50-year-old wrecks fly civilian routes, resulting in dozens of deaths.
Indeed, sanctions have a direct impact on the state of aviation in the Russian Federation. In fact, as of today, Russians cannot buy spare parts for the hundreds of thousands of foreign aircraft they possess. And many of these planes are simply sitting idle at airports and airfields because they can't be flown for the simple reason that they aren't being serviced on time. As a result, they're forced to use old Soviet-era aircraft like the AN-24 and so on, anything that can still fly, for which they can find at least some kind of spare parts. Even though these planes have long since exhausted their service life, they are forced to get these planes in the air and use them to transport people.
The long-standing head of government, Mishustin, has already formed a government commission. It is headed by the Minister of Transport, Andrei Nikitin, the very same person under whose department dozens of these dinosaurs continue to fly in Russian skies. But isn't all of this the result of one big crime called the system? And cases like these have only become more frequent since the start of the major war. Both civilian and military aircraft are breaking down. From 2022 to 2024, there have been 82 aviation incidents in Russia, including 40 crashes and 104 casualties. And with each passing year, this number has only grown. All of this is a consequence of the bloody war, which is impacting every sector of the Russian Federation. And the deeper the aggressor country gets bogged down in this protracted slaughter, the more terrifying the consequences become for itself.
Pete Hackett may resign from his post as head of the US Department of Defense. His subordinates are preparing the appropriate petition. We'll tell you what made the Playboy minister incur the wrath of his own staff, so give this episode a like and don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel Ukraine Today.
A mutiny on an American warship? Pentagon employees are preparing an open letter demanding that Donald Trump fire their boss, the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hackett.
Since May, drafts and letters have been circulating among senior and mid-level military leadership and civilian employees, calling to make it clear to the American public that this guy has no idea what he's doing.
According to journalists, the document could be published as early as next week. It contains a number of serious accusations. The head of the Pentagon is accused of making politicized decisions, creating an atmosphere of fear and paranoia, and ignoring the opinions of staff and experts.
How many more times does Pete Hackett have to deliberately leak highly sensitive intelligence information before Donald Trump and the Republicans truly realize that he's not just a damn liar, but a very real and significant threat to our national security? Hackett's utter stupidity puts US troops in danger.
At the same time, the Pentagon staff's letter is far from the first criticism directed at Pete Hackett.
Under the previous administration, we look like fools. We don't anymore, thanks to President Trump's leadership.
The defense minister's seat has been shaky for a long time now. At the very least, since the scandalous leak of correspondence between top US officials on the Signal Messenger.
The Trump administration accidentally sent me a message about their military plans. US national security leaders added me to a group chat about upcoming military strikes in Yemen. I didn't think it was real. And then the bombs started falling.
The so-called Signal incident cost Trump's national security advisor Michael Waltz his job. Hackett, who was also actively sharing American military secrets in those same chats, was forgiven for the leak.
I support Minister Haxet, who is doing a phenomenal job leading the Pentagon. This is what happens when the entire Pentagon is working against you and against the monumental changes you're trying to make.
A few weeks later, a new scandal. It turned out that at a meeting with the top military leadership of allied nations, the head of the Pentagon brought his wife along. In response to justified criticism, the minister only makes things worse by lashing out at the American media.
Fake news. He's just peddling garbage. That's his style. As for the campaign against the Houthis, I can say only one thing. Our military is acting with a high level of professionalism and courage. We are correcting the mistakes of the previous administration.
Another consequence of the scandal was that in his personal correspondence, the head of the Pentagon once again revealed his true position. The US Secretary of Defense is so indifferent to the fate of Europe and Ukraine that Haxet personally decides to suspend military aid to Ukraine.
We also want a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But the US does not consider Ukraine's membership in NATO a realistic outcome of a diplomatic resolution to the war. Haxet did not inform the White House before authorizing the suspension of arms deliveries to Ukraine.
The further it goes, the more toxic the head of the Pentagon becomes as a politician. And Donald Trump, as the stories of Michael Waltz and Elon Musk have shown, easily gets rid of such people in his circle.